watching something extraordinary unfold right now. America's unchallenged dominance is being tested in ways we haven't seen in decades. Mexico has just made a stunning pivot toward the BRICS alliance. And it's not because they suddenly stopped liking us. It's because our foreign policy has become rigid, too focused on military solutions, too reliant on economic coercion. Our own neighbors are beginning to look elsewhere for partnership. Russia, despite every sanction we've thrown at them, isn't collapsing. They're adapting, building new trade corridors, strengthening ties with the global South, and proving that the old playbook of isolation doesn't work anymore. This isn't about choosing sides or celebrating anyone's success. It's about recognizing a fundamental shift in how power operates globally. For 3 decades after the Cold War, we believed we could dictate terms to the entire world. We thought our economic model was the only viable path forward. We assumed our military reach gave us a permanent advantage. But coercion breeds resentment, and resentment breeds alternatives. What we're witnessing right now isn't the decline of American potential, it's the consequence of American overreach. Understanding that distinction is critical for our future. Let me tell you something that nobody in Washington wants to admit. We are living through one of the most significant geopolitical realignments in modern history, and most Americans have no idea it's happening. The comfortable narrative we've been fed for 30 years that America won the Cold War and therefore gets to write the rules for everyone else indefinitely is crumbling before our eyes. And the two countries forcing us to confront this reality couldn't be more different or more revealing. Mexico, our neighbor and 3rd largest trading partner, a country we've taken for granted for generations, is now seriously considering joining BRICS. And Russia, the country we've spent the last 2 years ying to economically destroy, is not only surviving, but actually expanding its influence across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. These aren't random events. They're symptoms of a much deeper problem in how we've chosen to exercise power in the post-Cold War era. Let's start with Mexico, because this one should really wake us up. Mexico's potential move toward BRICS isn't happening because they've become anti-American or suddenly fallen in love with Beijing or Moscow. It's happening because we've given them very few other options. Think about that carefully. For decades, we've treated Mexico as an economic appendage of the United States. We wanted their labor when it was cheap. We wanted their markets when it suited us. And we wanted them to be the front line in our war on drugs, a war that's been an unmitigated disaster for Mexican society. We've spent years lecturing them about corruption, while American guns have flooded south across the border, arming cartels and destabilizing entire regions. We've threatened them with tariffs, built walls, implemented immigration policies that separated families and treated them as a problem to be managed rather than a partner to be respected. Yet here's what's truly remarkable about Mexico's situation. They're not turning away from us out of spite. They're doing it out of necessity and self-interest, which is exactly what any sovereign nation should do. BRICS offers Mexico something we've been increasingly unwilling to provide: partnership without condescension, economic cooperation without political strings attached, and access to markets and financing that don't come with a lecture about how they should run their country. When China invests in infrastructure in Mexico, they don't attach conditions about judicial reform or human rights. When Russia talks about energy cooperation, they don't threaten sanctions if Mexico doesn't vote the right way at the United Nations. Now, that doesn't mean the Chinese or Russian AP approach is morally superior. That's not the point. The point is that our approach has become so heavy-handed, so self-serving, that we're pushing away countries that should be natural allies. The expansion of BRICS itself is a fascinating development that Americans need to understand far better. It started as nothing more than an acronym: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. A clever bit of marketing by an investment bank to highlight emerging markets. But what began as a financial term has evolved into something far more powerful: an alternative pole of influence in an increasingly multipolar world. And the expansion isn't random. Countries are lining up to join because BRICS represents an alternative to a system where the United States and its European allies make the rules, control the financial infrastructure, and weaponize the dollar and banking system against anyone who steps out of line. This shift isn't about ideology. It's about survival, autonomy, and balance. Which brings us to Russia, the case that exposes the full extent of Washington's miscalculations. We were told sanctions would cripple their economy. We were told cutting them off from SWIFT would devastate their trade. We were told Western companies leaving would collapse their industrial base. We were told the ruble would become rubble, Putin would fall, and the Russian people would rise up. None of that happened. Before anyone rushes to label this perspective pro-Russia, let's be clear, it's not about taking sides. It's about being pro-reality, and the reality is this. Our strategy hasn't produced the results we expected. Pretending otherwise is not just dishonest, it's dangerous. Russia has adapted in ways that should deeply concern us, not because we sympathize with Moscow, but because it reveals the limits of American economic power in the 21st century. They've redirected their energy exports to Asia. They've built alternative payment systems that bypass West. Earn financial channels. They've forged a deep strategic partnership with China, a level of cooperation that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. They've expanded their presence in Africa, filling the voids we created when our own partnerships proved too conditional, too exploitative, or too short-sighted to last. They've positioned themselves as a counterweight to Western influence in the Middle East, and nations in that region, long accustomed to choosing sides, are now hedging their bets, maintaining ties with both Moscow and Washington. They've learned that putting all their trust in one superpower is strategically foolish. And here's what should make us pause. Russia is achieving all this while under the most comprehensive sanctions regime ever imposed on a major economy. That's not necessarily proof of Russian strength, but it is undeniable evidence of the weakening effectiveness of our primary tool of coercion. We've used sanctions so often against so many that the rest of the world has simply adapted. They've built alternative payment systems, new trade routes, and parallel financial institutions. They've diversified their reserves away from the dollar. They've built networks of cooperation that specifically exclude us. In other words, through overuse, we force the world to innovate around our dominance. The dollar's role as the global reserve currency has long been one of America's greatest strategic advantages. It's allowed us to run massive deficits without suffering the same consequences other nations would face. It's given us the power to impose our will through financial pressure instead of direct military confrontation. But that advantage is slowly eroding, not because the dollar has become weak, but because more and more countries are working to reduce their dependence on it. When Saudi Arabia starts accepting yuan for oil sales, that's not just an economic decision, it's a geopolitical statement. When nations discuss creating a BRICS currency or expanding the use of local currency swaps, they're building the architecture for a new global system, one where American financial dominance is just one option among several, not the defining pillar of world trade. To understand how we got here, we have to confront the fundamental mistake we made after the Cold War. We treated the Soviet collapse as a final victory, not as a fragile transition to be managed carefully. We saw it as the ultimate validation of our system, not as an opportunity to build an inclusive international order. And because we saw it as victory, we acted like victors, entitled to dictate terms to everyone else. We expanded NATO eastward despite warnings from diplomats and Russia experts that doing so would create the very security crisis we now face. We supported color revolutions in former Soviet states without considering how Moscow might interpret Western-backed governments on its borders. We intervened in Libya, turning it from a functioning, if authoritarian state into a failed one. We invaded Iraq, killing hundreds of thousands, spending trillions of dollars, and creating the power vacuum that gave birth to ISIS. We involved ourselves in conflicts from Syria to Yemen to Somalia, often making fragile situations worse. And through it all, we wrapped every decision in the rhetoric of American exceptionalism. The idea that whatever we did, no matter how destructive, was somehow in the service of freedom and democracy. That mindset made it impossible to learn from failure, because admitting mistakes would mean questioning the myth of our moral superiority. Any criticism was dismissed as naive or anti-American. Any suggestion that we negotiate instead of dictate was framed as weakness. Any recognition that other nations might have legitimate interests conflicting with ours was treated as betrayal. This isn't strategic thinking, it's dogma. And dogma has no place in a world as complex as ours. The situatio, NS with Mexico and Russia, expose a larger pattern. Nations everywhere are diversifying their partnerships because relying too heavily on the United States has become risky. When we disagree with their domestic policies, we threaten sanctions. When they vote against us at the United Nations, we threaten to cut aid. When they build economic ties we don't approve of, we threaten their access to our markets. That's not diplomacy, that's coercion. And coercion only works when others have no alternative, but we're no longer the only option. The global economy has matured. China, India, Russia, and entire regional blocs now offer meaningful alternatives. When China builds ports and railways, when India opens its markets, when Russia offers discounted energy, these countries are giving others tangible reasons to diversify. The old assumption that everyone needs America to survive no longer holds. We still have immense power, militarily, economically, culturally, but power in the 21st century is not about domination, it's about influence. And influence depends on trust, credibility, and cooperation. Those are the things we've been burning through at an alarming rate. China's Belt and Road Initiative, for all its flaws and strategic ambitions, has proven something important. Most developing countries value tangible results over lectures. Roads, ports, power plants, and digital infrastructure are concrete. They create jobs, boost trade, and expand opportunities. When Western leaders criticize China's debt trap diplomacy, they often fail to ask the most basic question: why are nations choosing Chinese loans in the first place? The answer is usually simple. Western institutions like the World Bank and the IMF come with strings attached, politically toxic conditions that demand privatization, austerity, and deregulation. These policies often benefit Western corporations more than local populations. China, on the other hand, says, we'll build your port. Here, the loan, pay us back over time. It's transactional, predictable, and in many cases more appealing. Nations know the risks, but they also see the immediate rewards. The same logic applies to Russia's role in global energy markets. Europe's rapid attempt to cut itself off from Russian oil and gas was supposed to cripple Moscow. Instead, it ended up hurting European economies far more severely than expected. Russia redirected its exports to Asia, often at slightly discounted prices, while maintaining steady revenue streams. India dramatically increased its imports of Russian crude. China secured long-term gas deals at favorable rates. From Russia's perspective, they lost access to one market and gained several others. And at the same time, they demonstrated that Western sanctions could be absorbed, adapted to, and even turned into strategic leverage. Europe, meanwhile, paid higher prices for replacement energy and struggled with inflation and political unrest. The supposed victory turned into a painful lesson in global interdependence. The global South has been watching this play out with sharp attention. Nations across Africa, Latin America, and Asia, countries that aren't firmly aligned with either the West or the Russia-China axis, are studying how power actually functions in this new era. They're seeing that countries defying Washington are not only surviving, but in some cases thriving. They're seeing the double standards in how the West applies its rules-based order. They remember Iraq, where we invaded without UN authorization. They remember Libya, where Western intervention created chaos. They watch our policies in Israel and Palestine, where we provide diplomatic cover for actions much of the world condemns. And they draw conclusions. To them, American leadership has become synonymous with selective morality, defending rules when convenient, ignoring them when not. This isn't about claiming America is worse than Russia or China is. It's about recognizing that credibility is a form of power, and once lost, it's hard to regain. For decades, America's moral authority magnified its influence. We didn't just have the biggest military or economy, we had the world's trust. That trust is eroding because we've forgotten that power without principle breeds resistance, not respect, to be clear. America has done enormous good in the world. Our leadership built international institutions that maintain peace and stability for generations. Our innovation, our culture, and our ideals inspired billions. But those achievements are overshadowed when we overthrow governments, support dictators when convenient, or look the other way when allies commit abuses. The rest of the world is no longer blind to this hypocrisy. They see it, they talk about it, and they're acting accordingly. Mexico's possible move toward BRICS should be a wake-up call, not just about Mexico, but about our entire approach to Latin America. For 2 centuries, we've treated that region as our backyard. We felt our interests were threatened. We've overthrown elected governments, backed military coups, and imposed economic policies that benefited U.S. corporations while impoverishing local populations. Now we act surprised when those same nations seek alternatives. The truth is, the Monroe Doctrine mindset, the idea that Latin America belongs in our sphere of control, is obsolete. These are sovereign nations with their own ambitions, their own strategies, their own grievances. And those grievances are shaping their decisions in ways that no amount of pressure or persuasion can easily reverse. Our struggle to compete with China in Latin America perfectly captures the flaws of our foreign policy. China has quietly become the largest trading partner for most South American countries. It's built railways, power plants, fiber optic networks, ports. It's offered billions in loans and investments without demanding political reforms or imposing the ideological conditions that often accompany Western aid. Meanwhile, our approach has been to issue warnings, to tell these nations that China is dangerous, that its influence is corrosive, that they should stick with us for their own good. But here's the problem. We rarely offer a better deal. We don't match China's infrastructure investments. We don't provide more favorable financial terms. We don't propose a compelling alternative that meets the practical needs of these countries. We rely instead on fear, loyalty, and nostalgia, assuming that shared history or proximity will be enough to keep nations in our orbit. That's not strategy, that's arrogance. Russia's endurance under sanctions underscores the same lesson. Military might and economic dominance no longer guarantee influence. They are tools, not outcomes. We have the strongest military in the world, but it hasn't delivered victory or stability in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, or Libya. We have the largest economy, but countries now calculate that the benefits of defying us sometimes outweigh the costs. Power is no longer centralized, it's dispersed, and that diffusion makes the world harder to control through old methods of dominance. The Ukraine conflict brought all of this into sharper focus. From our perspective, it's a moral battle. Democracy against tyranny, sovereignty against aggression. But much of the world doesn't see it that way. They see a proxy war between global powers with Ukraine as the battleground. They remember how we justified our own interventions with the same moral language. They recall Iraq, Kosovo, Libya, and they question whether our current stance is really about principles or about preserving influence. Let's be clear, Russia's invasion of Ukraine was wrong. It violated international law and human decency. But acknowledging that doesn't erase our own record of selective morality. When we dismiss the skepticism of the global South, as Russian propaganda, we ignore the fact that their doubts come from experience, from decades of watching America preach one thing and practice another. Our moral authority to lead a global response has been compromised, not by lies from Moscow, but by the truths of our own behavior. Until we face that, our calls for unity will sound hollow to much of the world. And there's an even darker dimension to this conflict, one that isn't being discussed nearly enough. We are in the most dangerous nuclear standoff since the Cuban Missile Crisis, perhaps even more dangerous. Yet there's almost no public debate about it. We're supplying weapons that are striking inside Russian territory. We're training Ukrainian forces and sharing real-time intelligence. From Moscow's perspective, NATO is directly at war with them, and they've updated their nuclear doctrine in response to that perception. The casual way we've drifted into this situation should terrify anyone who remembers the logic of deterrence. One miscalculation, one escalation, one misinterpreted signal could spiral into catastrophe. The danger isn't just theoretical, it's structural. We've created a geopolitical environment where neither side trusts the other enough to de-escalate and where admitting limits is seen as weakness. That's not strength. That's recklessness disguised as resolve. At the core of this recklessness is a deeper intellectual failure. We've lost the ability to think in terms of interests instead of absolutes. Every foreign policy issue becomes a moral crusade. You're either with us or against us. You're for freedom or for tyranny. This binary way of thinking makes genuine diplomacy nearly impossible. How do you negotiate with evil? How do you compromise with a villain? But the truth is, international relations have never been about good versus evil. They've always been about balancing interests, finding ways for nations with different systems to coexist, and preventing conflict from consuming everything. It's not about perfection, it's about survival. The illusion of moral purity in foreign policy has blinded us to the complexity of power. Nations do not act out of virtue, they act out of necessity. When we define every opponent as evil and every ally as righteous, we lose the capacity for strategic clarity. We stop asking why other nations make the choices they do. We stop listening. And when a superpower stops listening, it begins to decline, not because of external enemies, but because of its own hubris. Look at how our narratives collapse under scrutiny. We claim to defend democracy, yet we support authoritarian regimes when it suits our interests. We speak of human rights, yet ignore violations committed by allies. We talk about freedom, yet impose sanctions that cripple ordinary people while leaving elites untouched. The contradiction is visible to the entire world. You cannot sell the image of moral leadership while practicing selective justice. It doesn't work anymore, not in an age when information is global, instant, and permanent. What's emerging now is not a rejection of America's ideals. It's a rejection of our double standards. People still admire the Constitution, free speech, innovation, and creativity that define our nation. What they no longer believe is that we live by those same principles internationally. That disbelief erodes the foundation of our influence faster than any weapon or sanction ever could. Power grounded in hypocrisy is power on borrowed time. China understands this better than most. It rarely moralizes in its foreign policy rhetoric. Instead, it speaks the language of partnership, respect, and mutual development, even when its actions are self-serving. Tone matters, the perception matters. When African leaders meet with Chinese officials, they are not lectured about corruption or governance. They are offered deals. Whether those deals are fair or not, they're framed in a way that gives dignity to the counterpart. That's something America often forgets. Dignity is a form of currency in international relations. Russia, for all its aggression, has also mastered the narrative of resistance. It presents itself as the defender of sovereignty against Western domination. That story resonates deeply with countries that have been invaded, colonized, or economically subjugated by the West in the past century. It's propaganda, yes, but effective propaganda works because it contains recognizable truths. The world doesn't have to like Moscow or Beijing to understand why they push back against Washington. Meanwhile, our own communication strategy feels frozen in time, full of Cold War vocabulary and self-congratulatory slogans. We talk about the free world, but the line between freedom and control has blurred in our own society. We speak of defending democracy, but our political system is paralyzed by corruption, polarization, and corporate influence. To many abroad, we sound like a nation preaching what it can no longer practice. Rebuilding credibility requires more than better messaging, it requires transformation. We must learn humility, the kind that comes from recognizing that being powerful doesn't make us always right. It means listening to others, even when their perspectives challenge our sense of moral superiority. It means understanding that multipolarity is not a threat to civilization, but an inevitable phase in human history. No empire lasts forever, and those that cling to control instead of adaptation only accelerate their decline. The truth is, America could still lead, not as an empire, but as an example. We could lead by cooperation instead of coercion, by fairness instead of dominance, by strength that comes from integrity, not intimidation. But that would require a revolution in consciousness, a willingness to question not just our strategies, but our entire worldview. Because the crisis we face isn't merely geopolitic, Al. It's psychological. It's the refusal to accept that the age of unilateral control is over, the refusal to admit that others now have agency, power, and vision. The world is no longer asking America for permission. It's asking whether we're capable of genuine partnership or destined to repeat the mistakes of every fallen empire before us. Every empire in history has faced the same moment, the quiet tipping point where dominance begins to decay from within. It never happens all at once. It begins with denial, with the illusion that nothing has changed. The Romans called it the eternal city. The British called it the empire on which the sun never sets. We call it American exceptionalism. The words change, but the psychology doesn't. Every empire believes its power is permanent, its values universal, its mission divinely ordained, and every empire learns too late that history has no favorites. Our exceptionalism, once rooted in optimism, has hardened into entitlement. We believe the world owes us gratitude simply because we built institutions that once served humanity well. But gratitude fades when leadership becomes exploitation. Influence erodes when example turns into hypocrisy. The tragedy of American power today is not that it's ending, it's that we are wasting the chance to evolve it into something higher. We could have become the great collaborator of the 21st century, a nation that leads through wisdom instead of force. Instead, we cling to dominance like an aging monarch refusing to yield the throne. We measure greatness by the size of our military, the reach of our bases, the obedience of our allies. But real greatness is measured by moral authority, the ability to inspire rather than intimidate. And right now, the world sees a superpower that demands loyalty but rarely offers respect. The global South doesn't hate America. It's disappointed in us. They remember the Marshall Plan, the Peace Corps, the human rights movements we once championed. They remember when America stood for possibility, for something larger than self-interest. But now, too often, we act like the very empires we once opposed, transactional, arrogant, and self-righteous. We speak the language of democracy while practicing the logic of dominance. This hypocrisy has costs. It fuels the rise of alternative alliances, BRICS, SCO, Eurasian partnerships, not because these nations share a common ideology, but because they share a common grievance, the need to escape the gravitational pull of American control. The more we tighten our grip, the faster they slip away. The more we threaten, sanction, or isolate, the more we accelerate the very multipolar world we fear. Meanwhile, at home, we are fragmenting. The same arrogance that defines our foreign policy infects our domestic politics. We no longer listen to each other. We shout, label, and cancel. The tribalism we once exported abroad now consumes us from within. The empire is turning inward, devouring its own cohesion. Our divisions are no longer ideological, they're existential. We've lost the shared narrative that once united us, the belief that we were moving, however imperfectly, toward a more just and enlightened future. Empires don't fall because they are conquered. They fall because they rot from within. Corruption, cynicism, and complacency corrode the moral foundations that once sustained them. When a nation loses faith in its own integrity, it begins to collapse spiritually long before it collapses militarily or economically. That is the danger America faces today, not invasion, but implosion. Yet decline is not destiny. History offers another path, transformation through humility. Every empire that has fallen has also left behind wisdom for those willing to listen. The lesson is simple but profound. Power must evolve or it perishes. Control must give way to cooperation. Arrogance must yield to awareness. The nations that endure are not those that dominate, but those that adapt. We still have time to remember who we are, not as rulers of the world, but as stewards of progress, as partners in a shared human story. But time is running out. The longer we deny the shifting tides of history, the harsher the reckoning becomes. The question is no longer whether the world will change, it already has. The question is, whether America will have the courage to change with it. The future will not be defined by who dominates, but by who cooperates. The age of empire is giving way to the age of interdependence, an era in which no nation can stand above the rest without eventually collapsing under the weight of its own isolation. The world is no longer built on obedience to a single power. It's built on networks, on mutual interests, on shared survival. Climate change, pandemics, artificial intelligence, and migration. These are challenges no superpower can solve alone. Yet our foreign policy still behaves as if competition is the only language worth speaking. What if, instead of guarding influence, we cultivated trust? What if our strength came from building rather than breaking, from empathy rather than enforcement? The nations of the world are not looking for a new master. They are looking for a partner who understands that leadership in this century means collaboration, not control. The American ideal was never meant to be a throne. It was meant to be a light. Somewhere along the way, that light dimmed beneath the shadow of ambition. But it can be reignited not through dominance, but through integrity. To do that, we must confront the illusion of separation, the false belief that America's fate can be detached from the world's. We rise and fall together. The crises abroad are reflections of the crises within us. Our wars reveal our fears. Our alliances mirror our insecurities. The instability we export is often born from the instability we refuse to heal at home. The empire abroad is only as healthy as the democracy, racy within. If we cannot restore balance inside our own borders, we will never command respect beyond them. It begins with honesty, the courage to face the truth of what we've become, the courage to admit that our foreign policy has often served the few at the expense of the many, the courage to accept that we have at times been the very force of coercion we once swore to resist. But honesty, though painful, is liberating. It creates space for renewal. When we confront our contradictions, we recover our capacity to lead by example, the only kind of leadership that lasts. A new global order is forming, whether we acknowledge it or not. It will not be Western or Eastern, capitalist or socialist, but something more fluid, a mosaic of interests, values, and voices. America can either resist it and fade into irrelevance, or embrace it and help shape it with wisdom, fairness, and humility. The real test of our greatness will not be our ability to impose, but our ability to inspire, not our power to command, but our willingness to understand. If we can evolve, if we can remember that leadership is not about fear, but faith, not about supremacy, but service, then America can still play its greatest role yet, the bridge between worlds, the conscience of power, the nation that learned how to lead without dominating. That is the transformation history demands. That is the future worth fighting for. Because in the end, every empire faces the same question. Will it collapse from pride, or will it transcend through wisdom? The choice remains ours. The clock is ticking, but redemption is still possible. If we choose humility over hubris, truth over illusion, cooperation over control, then perhaps the American story is not ending. Perhaps it's only just beginning again. We are witnessing something extraordinary unfold in the Caribbean. Something
Kamala Harris, who was vice president, with Pedo Pete, with a pedophile, and the guy who was president before that everyone's forgotten was president before, Donald Trump. And they're like, he's gonna fix everything. And the other side's like, she's gonna fix everything. It's like they both fucked it up. It's all fucked up because of them. They both tried to kill everyone. No one seems to notice. No one seems to care. I feel like I'm taking crazy pills.
I feel like I'm taking crazy pills!
That's all, folks.